All right, we are back with a wonderful episode that I've been really planning to take the show in a particular direction that I've always been interested in. I've never had much experience in, but this is Gregorian chant and chant in general. Of course, I think a lot of my audience have noticed I've dipped into the 16th century, the 17th century a little bit, but I really want to explore that more. And I think I love the history of Western music, and I feel there's so much richness and wonderful things to discuss. And Gregorian chant, I mean, Mozart said it, right? I think he'd give everything to if he could compose the preface, right? So I have here Dr. Charles Weaver. Dr. Weaver, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for inviting me. Glad to be here.
Well, it's a huge topic, and I think we have a lot of great things to talk about. And but why don't I think it would be good if you just introduced yourself and just talked about your journey a little bit. That'll frame everything.
Sure. So my musical background is essentially that I was a lute player. I started as a guitarist, like most people who play the lute, and I got really interested in early music when I was in college. I started at the Peabody Conservatory in Baltimore, which has a huge classical guitar department. But while I was there, I saw a performance of Monteverdi's Orfeo and became very interested in Baroque opera. So I spent about a decade and a half doing things like playing Baroque opera full time. And in 2014, I started teaching lute at the Juilliard School. And our program there is very much based around continual playing and accompaniment. And in 2018, they asked me to start teaching a theory class, essentially a Baroque theory class that was designed specifically for people doing historical performance. And that really launched me in a completely different direction. I found that I gravitated towards that way of teaching and engaging with music in a classroom setting. And so I ended up going back to school and getting a doctorate in music theory. And of course, I started in fall of 2019. So the pandemic happened in my first year. And I had planned to, do my research on Rameau or 18th century harmony or something like that. But um, my entire adult life, I've also sung in church choirs and with a specialty in singing Gregorian chant. So when COVID happened, essentially the only music making I continued to do was chant. And I realized how important it was to me and how many interesting topics, as you've already alluded to, there are just to think about with Gregorian chant. So I ended up going in kind of a different direction with my research. And I wrote my dissertation on the theory of rhythm in Gregorian chant, specifically the Solem school, which of course is famous for their performances of chant and the sort of revival of Gregorian chant in the 20th century. Um, and I bring a lot of that to my teaching at Juilliard. Now I'm full time there, so I teach a bunch of different classes. I teach historical music theory. I teach an ear training class that's geared specifically for the historical performers. I teach performance practice, improvisation, all that sort of stuff. So I've long admired your show, and Gregorian chant always seems to be a kind of peripheral topic that keeps coming up because it's so central to the pedagogy of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. So it's really great to kind of focus on it specifically because it's so
Yeah.
it was important, as you said. Mozart knew about it, and it's an aspect of music making that we just don't think about all that much. I mean, chant didn't go away, but the way we teach it in history class is you cover chant in the first 5 minutes, or I'm being a little hyperbolic. You cover chant in the first class or two of your history survey, and then you never talk about it again. But actually, all the musicians of the kind of common practice era would have been familiar with it. It would have been an extremely common form of music making, and shouldn't be dismissed lightly for that reason.
I mean, just on the face of it, it's beautiful. I mean, it's maybe the most beautiful thing, I mean, that in music, because it's pure melody. It's often sung in a church. The acoustics are sensational. It's just really arresting stuff. And I've always wanted to really focus more on it because I think it's just really wonderful stuff. So you were experienced in it. Did you know about all these problems of interpretation in chant when you were doing it as a young man? And when did you like start to like look at it a little closer?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because the typical way chant is done is you have square notes that have, if they communicate any rhythmic information at all, it's very different from the way we think about musical rhythm in every other context, right? In most music, we have uh, things like beats and measures and phrases that are somewhat regular and musical meter. And chant, for the most part, at least the way it's done by most people, doesn't have any of those things. And so it was always in the background of my thinking, the fact that we have a really difficult time describing things like the rhythm of chant and how it should work. But it was really when I started focusing more on music theory as a discipline and thinking about things like how rhythm works in all music that I realized that chant has very particular problems, especially because of this idea of free rhythm. It's really hard to talk about musical rhythm in general. It's a really difficult thing to describe. Um, it's actually not easy to stand in front of a class of college freshmen and explain what a beat is or what a measure is. Those are not simple concepts, and those issues are only compounded when you say, actually, this is free rhythm, whatever that is.
Right. So maybe we should just jump in and grasp the whole heart of it. So there's what something like 5 ways to interpret Gregorian chant. What's the most popular way? What's the right way? What's the wrong way? I'm sure everyone has a different opinion on that, but maybe you could just give the 5 minute just overview of chant.
Sure. I would be happy to do that. It's a really old repertoire. It's been in continuous use since the 9th century, which means we have some 1,200 years of uh, performance of it as a living tradition to various extents. And I wish there were only 5 ways to interpret it, but there are probably many more than that. Um, in general, the the way we talk about it almost prejudices us towards a certain uh, way of thinking. I'm thinking in particular of we use the word plain chant to describe um, Gregorian chant. And that word plain in that context actually means no rhythmic differentiation at all. So you have a bunch of notes, they're drawn as squares, and they're sung with more or less rhythmic equalism. And we could just say every note is the same length, and the musical rhythm that results is just it's melody without any rhythmic differentiation between notes, and we might call that equalism. Also, plain chant might refer to that way of thinking. However, if you look at the earliest sources, the earliest neumes that we have, which are some of the first musical notations in the Western world, and which are also the sort of the basis of all subsequent notation that we use, you can see a great variety of uh, neume signs and symbols, which seem to mean some kind of rhythmic differentiation. So some people interpret that in a kind of nuanced way. So they think, well, there's basically equal rhythm, but maybe if they draw the symbol in a particular way, it means that they spent a little more time on this note. something like an expression mark. And that's kind of the basis of what is maybe the most popular interpretation among historically informed performers right now, what we would call Gregorian semiology.
Mm,
And the idea there is that you're interpreting the information given in the notation in a way that is informing how you're going to perform the notes rhythmically. Then I would say another historically informed approach to look at would be what's called mensuralism. And that's got essentially the same information input as semiology, but you couple it with ideas of classical verse meter, ancient Greek and Roman poetry transmitted to the medieval world through St. Augustine. And the idea there is that you have these symbols. However, you really only have usually two note values, a kind of long one and a short one. So you can look at the same manuscript as the semiologist and decide actually you could transcribe this using, say, quarter notes and eighth notes and having a kind of more measured approach. And there are arguments on both sides of those. And as you might imagine, it gets pretty bitter in the debate. So those are we have equalism, semiology, mensuralism, and then maybe the one that most people think of when they think of Gregorian chant is what's called the Solem method, and this was the one I kind of did my research on. Solem is an abbey in France that was refounded after the French Revolution. So in the 1830s, it was reestablished as an abbey, and the monks there have specialized in publishing editions and critical commentary on Gregorian chant ever since that time. And they developed a way of singing that's essentially based on principles of rhetoric. So
mm,
you have things like the word accent governs how you shape the word when you perform. So it's not really equalist. It's also not really fully semiological because it's based on some of these outside ideas, not just the historical sources, but maybe the broader idea of rhythmic performance based on rhetoric. And then you can subdivide the Solem method into the kind of different generations of it. So in the earliest instance, there was a monk working there named Joseph Potier who published in around 1880 a really significant book. That's him right there. A really significant book on the interpretation of chant based on these accentual rhetorical principles. Essentially, the word accent is the thing that governs how you approach small units of musical time in chant. And then as you get to larger phrases, you have things like emphasis and accent within a sentence, forming this kind of beautiful dynamic rhetorical structure. And
Was
then
he the guy? Sorry,
mhm.
Dr. Weaver. Was he the guy who had some kind of contest and smoked everyone? I mean, there was like some. I don't know if that's a thing, but like they had a. Why don't you sing your way? You sing your way. We'll judge who's better. And like one guy was really convincing.
uh, there have been many such things over the years. I can't think of the particular one that you're thinking of there, but I mean, you could imagine in the context of 19th century France, if the way chant was typically performed before the advent of the Solem method, it was very heavy, very slow,
Mm,
and there are kind of two ways of looking at that. You can say you would sing the chant very heavily and slowly, and it would be accompanied by an instrument like the serpent or the ophicleida. The pitch was quite low in general, and it was often the basis for all these wonderful improvisatory practices like falso bordone and this sort of thing. So to if you imagine that is the sort of backdrop on which Solem enters, all of a sudden you have this very beautifully nuanced and shaped way of performing the melodies that respects the words, and it must have been quite revelatory in a way because
Mm,
you're essentially doubling the tempo um,
mm,
of the music, and all of a sudden all these other sort of aspects of the melody would pop out at you, and you'd realize, oh, this is actually this very beautiful um, cantillation, which it's really hard to even discern that kind of melody. If you imagine, this kind of heavy brass accompanied dirge-like approach,
yeah.
so Solem just it was quite eye-opening for people and sort of became quite worldwide as a result. But then what's interesting is that Potier left Solem, and his successor as choirmaster at the monastery was this guy, André Mocquereau, who was the subject of my own research. And Mocquereau, if you're familiar with the Liber Usualis, it's probably the most widespread chant edition in the world. It has this way of interpreting the rhythm where you divide the music into sort of beats and groups of 2 and 3 notes, and you have all these rules for how to shape things. Essentially, it's like a rationalization of the Solem method. Um, a lot of the monks in general at Solem have not been musicians, right? Most people
Hmm.
enter people enter the monastery for all manner of reasons, but usually it's not because they are interested in Gregorian chant. That's something that sort of comes upon them later after their religious interests and spiritual lives and all that sort of stuff. Mocro, before he entered, was actually basically a professional level cellist working in France. And so he comes into the abbey, becomes the choirmaster, and sees this idea of rhetorical rhythm and says, well, we need to figure out how that actually works and establish some rules for it. So you might call that kind of the new Solem method or the classic Solem method. So those are the 5 ways. There's pure equalism, plain chant, um, with all manner of nuance that one might or might not add to it, but essentially taking a kind of agnostic approach to rhythm on the one hand. Number 2 would be semiology, which is kind of you look at the earliest manuscripts and interpret according to the differentiation in neum shapes. Number 3 would be mensuralism, where you do the same thing, but you essentially make long and short values of proportional duration to each other. 4 would be this kind of free rhetorical approach, and 5 would be the Solem method of Mocquereau, which is the one you might encounter, if you listen to classic recordings of Gregorian chant, say. But really, I mean, it's such a huge repertoire that I'm sure there are many, many other ways to describe it.
But what's the most popular way? Not necessarily the best, but the most popular way.
I would say that the Solem method, at least in the English-speaking world, is still pretty widespread. If you go into a parish church where people are singing chant, in North America or in Great Britain, you're quite likely to encounter this way of singing.
Old or
Among
new? The old way or the new way?
the newer one.
The Makaro.
Newer,
Okay.
yeah, and so that's essentially, you've got square notes, but you also have these dots and dashes and things that tell you which notes are longer than others. Um, and so I would say that's probably the most frequently encountered approach in the English-speaking world. It's different in other places. And then among sort of historically informed performers, if you do chant with an early music group, to the extent that they do rhythmic interpretation at all, you're likely to hear semiology or mensuralism as kind of the two, most informed ways of doing it. And the idea there is that you want to recreate as much as possible what the chant sounded like in the ninth century, to the extent that we can know that, which we kind of can't necessarily. And of course, if you're doing Baroque music and you want to have some chant, you might think about interpreting it the way they sang it in the Baroque era, which was kind of different. Usually, some form of mensuralism, to the extent that the words, are are set in a fairly measured way, which allows you to improvise accompaniment and things like that. So I would say I'm not sure that I know if there's one that's sort of there is no kind of worldwide standard, let's say, but there are all these different approaches kind of overlapping.
Did the church say this is the right way? Did that ever happen? I mean,
Well, that's
I heard there's
yeah.
a Vatican edition, so that's quite significant, right?
Yes, that's what's so interesting about this because it in throughout the kind of common practice period that we think about with music, chant would have been very much a local phenomenon. You could interpret it differently in different places. Some people would favor a sort of equalist approach, other people a more measured approach. However, that man on the screen, uh, Giuseppe Sarti, became pope in 1903, Pius X, and he was a fan of the Solemn reforms from before his papacy. And one of his first acts as pope was to publish a document called Tra le Sollecitudine, which established essentially that we're going to reform church music from the top down. We're going to get rid of kind of operatic singing at mass, get rid of theatricality, and restore Gregorian chant in its supposed pristine condition. And
So
the
we're
way
not
we're
gonna
going to
have
do that
the sextet from Lucia, right? From Donizetti, and
exactly. If you're
right?
familiar with, the wonderful masses by Gounod, uh, you know what these kind of 19th century
Yeah,
approaches. It's musically indistinguishable from opera, and
right.
that's what people liked. Uh, and Pius X essentially said that the ideal music for the church and for the sacred liturgy is Gregorian chant, and that specifically the monks of Salem are going to be entrusted with creating this new edition, what we now call the Vatican edition. The chants for the Mass came out gradually. The Ordinary of the Mass came out in 1906, and the entire Graduale, which is the book you need to sing chant at the Mass, came out in 1908. And what's interesting is that there was this feud between Old Solem and New
Mm.
Solem at the time that that happened. So Potier and Mocquereau were both on the committee in charge of establishing this new edition. But by that time, Potier had left Solem and was the abbot of Saint-Vendry, which is another abbey in uh, and Mocquereau had sort of succeeded him at Solem and replaced Potier's ideas with his own kind of more uh, rationalized version. And so they were feuding the entire time, and Mocquereau ended up resigning from the committee. Um, and he got his revenge because the church published this Vatican edition without Mocquereau's rhythmic signs, but because Solem had the copyright to all the music on which the edition was based, they worked out this deal with the Pope where Solem would be allowed to publish their proprietary editions where they add all the dots and dashes. And those, at least in the English speaking world and elsewhere as well, became much more widespread than the Vatican edition. It's really extraordinary to get back to your question that the Pope, the supreme head of the Roman Catholic Church, decided that performance practice was going to be a priority for him, and that you had to adopt, in particular, this performance practice of these French monks. And he probably didn't quite know what he was getting into vis-a-vis this feud, um, but essentially, the church mandated around that time that chant should be sung from this edition and that you should use this free rhythmic approach adopted at Salem. And there was some back and forth over whether which version of Salem to do. And as you might imagine, it got kind of heated. But the upshot is that the church at that point basically said free rhythm is the way to go. But I would say that's the high watermark of papal involvement in in Gregorian chant.
But when you say mandate, did Pius X say you have to sing it this way, or did he just say that this is preferred?
He basically said you have to sing it this way.
Okay.
That by promulgating this edition, he's also promulgating this idea of free rhythm. And in particular, in Germany, there were these very cherished mensuralist ways of singing, and essentially those were cracked down upon by the Pope, and through working through his the office in charge of such things, which in this case is the Congregation for Sacred Rites. So they would sort of correspond with people working in countries and say, no, no, the Pope intends you to sing it this way with a kind of free rhythm approach.
So it's over, right? So so basically, why did people say no? I really like the old Salem method, so I'm going to keep going it. And would you want to demonstrate maybe like the two divert? Like, is that possible? Like, you can show us like
Yeah,
what's the difference?
if we have a piece of chant, I could sort of show you what the
Yeah, sure.
difference is.
You sent me some stuff. Do you, is there of those things? Are they good? We can use.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay,
I think
so
there's that handout, maybe the first thing I sent you.
okay, so really, before we start, it's really old Salem versus new Salem. The other ones were not really. Is that really the case?
Well, no, I mean, I think we should maybe hear all four approaches.
Okay, great. Yeah.
Yeah, because essentially, as I said, there was this sort of high watermark, but after that, after the Second Vatican Council, when essentially chant no longer was mandated in this strict way, it really opened up the interpretation to a bunch of different approaches.
Mm.
So yeah, what I thought maybe we could do is sing the same melody different ways so people could kind of hear what we're talking about vis-a-vis all these the idea of free rhetorical rhythm, uh, semiological interpretation, et cetera, et cetera. So what we have on the screen is a communion antiphon, and the text is printed below. And I guess I could sing it first according to the kind of free rhetorical approach, the old Solem way. And if you the notation here is pretty easy to read. It looks like a medieval manuscript, but that's an illusion. This is actually the way the Vatican edition was printed. The clef at the beginning is a C clef on the top line.
Mm.
So if you know kind of tenor clef, the first pitch is F, and each note is essentially more or less equal, but you would phrase moving towards the word accents and trying to group the neumes in this rhetorical way. So if you're singing in the kind of free solemn approach, it would sound something like this. Inclina aurem tua accelera uteruas nos. And the idea there is that you are
That
separating
was
the word.
nice.
Oh, thank you.
Very
Yeah,
nice. So
it's
again,
you
which
can
one?
see,
Free
yeah,
Salem. Free
mhm.
Salem is the old one, or is that the new one?
Yeah. That's the old one. That's the old one.
That was good. That was really.
Well, the thing
What?
is that they're all good.
Yeah.
The chant being this, that melody is essentially at least 1,200 years old, and it can be subjected to pretty much any way of singing it, and
Oh, this is going to be an impossible debate then. If everything is good, then we're in trouble. So- okay, but anyway, keep going on.
Sure. So if the idea is that you're separating each word and it just with a little bit of time. So spacing after words, larger spacing after groups of words and phrases and things like that. So that's the old Solem approach based on free rhetoric. if you scroll down to the second section, you can see the kind of newer Solem approach. That would be, I think, like 2.4, 2.5, something like
Oh,
that.
okay. Let me find it. So 2.4. Is that
There
it?
you go.
Okay.
Yep. So here's the same chant, and you can see if you were to compare the notations that there are all these little things added. So it's essentially the same clef, same staff, the same square notes. However, if you look over the third syllable, of the first word, inclina, there's a little dash over that num in the space. And what that tells you is that in this case, Mocquereau, the editor of the Solem method, has looked at the old manuscripts and determined that that num should be sung a little more slowly. Um, and he adds dots at the ends of phrases. And then he also, the third symbol we see on there is the vertical line. If you look at the word
This?
accelera,
Oh.
essentially, yeah, on that syllable le, the vertical lines tell you that those are the
Oh.
beginning of what he considers to be beat groups. And
Okay.
so, you could actually count this according to his method, and if and the the symbols there on accelera tell you that that syllable on le should be counted 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. It's sort of grouped into 3 groups of 2. Whereas the Potier version was much more free than that. Essentially, the important, syllable for Potier is the accelera because che gets the accent, and the le should sort of follow after and maybe have a bit of a retard on it, but he doesn't subdivide the group in quite the same way. Whereas Mocquereau says, no, no, you're going to count that 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, and it's going to be easier to keep your choir together as a result. So maybe I could sing it according to the Solem method now. And the kind of other aspect of it is that you have these groups. You would actually count. Um, if I were count singing from the beginning, following Mocquereau's rules, it would count like this: 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Which sounds, by comparison to Potier, somewhat rigid because now we've added beats. However, it can result in a rather lovely musical performance because it makes it easy to conduct and easy to kind of teach your singers the rules. And then within that, you can kind of lay on this expressive way of singing. So this would sound something like this. Inclina orem tua accelera uteruas nos.
It's a nice
And that's
tune.
yeah, it's also nice. Uh,
It's
you
a
know,
bit more like
the
in the grid.
it's a little bit on the grid, which makes it kind of easier to practice if you're with a choir. It's easy to conduct, it's easy to learn the rules, it's easy to sight read,
In
um,
in
as
practice, do
a
you
group.
find between the two methods, the second one, the Mocquereau version, is just more practical in real life?
I think in a lot of ways that is true because it simplifies, the rhythm, right? You no longer, um now you're concerned with things like, how to conduct your choir. It's much easier to conduct a choir if you think about it, if you have beats than it is if you just have essentially rhythmic information contained only in the phrase structure of the Latin text. I mean, that makes it a little harder to get down to the nitty-gritty of conducting your group. And so, yeah, the Mocquereau approach is basically just more practical. It makes sense in that he was a musician before he became a monk and was interested in applying musical training and that sort of thing to this idea of free rhythm.
Hmm. Great. Okay. It's hard to say which is better, huh? But I would say, just from what you've just said, just in the practical order, the second way is probably more useful in sense of getting a choir up and going and rehearsing. I mean, a big thing you've talked about is sight reading, right? So, do you do much rehearsal anyway, or do you just like take the
Well,
sheet
it
and
it
go for it
depends
with a
on
group?
what group I'm with. With the group I conduct on Sunday mornings, these are men that have been singing the chant basically their entire adult lives. So we actually don't rehearse the chant. We usually rehearse the polyphonic music that's going to go along with it, um, because we've all been around the kind of annual liturgical cycle so many times. Most of us have a lot of the chants memorized, and
Mm,
we're just using the music as a kind of way to refresh our memory about it. Because it's a big repertoire, but it's also it comes around every year. It's a little bit like the way we all know the same Christmas songs that we
yeah.
hear every year. It's just that instead of being like that for Christmas, it's like that for every Sunday. And so you open up the book and you say, okay, this is this Sunday. I know how this goes. Doesn't require a whole lot of advanced preparation.
So, what are the chief arguments that the other side give passionately, and what are the main points essentially?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Mocquereau method is easily criticizable because it's not based on anything historical. There's not a single musical medieval author who says all chant comes in these beats of two,
Mm,
and you have to count it this way. And uh, it's essentially ahistorical. And if you want to be quite brutally honest about it, it's a 19th century approach to music making.
mm,
The idea of creating phrases using rhythmic nuance and rhythmic expression and accelerando and um, retardando
mm,
and dynamics and having the dynamics and the rhythmic kind of impetus reinforce each other. If you think about it, that's of course a 19th century French cellist would come up with such a way of singing chant because um, we're all creatures of our time and our prior musical formation. So he's a romantic musician, and so he sings chant in this romantic way. However, from a kind of modern, historically informed point of view, um, he's not basing that on any medieval information. He's basing it on his own musical intuition. He's interacting with medieval music in a way that's um, essentially romantic, and it creates a beautiful product. I love this way of chanting, and I'm quite fond of it. But it is essentially the opposite of historically informed performance. It's imposing this outside 19th century idea. So I believe some of your guests in the past have often criticized the Solem method because of this very reason, and especially if you're thinking about it from the point of view of 18th century music, or if you're interested in the solfeggio tradition of Baraguanith or
mm,
something like that.
yep.
From that point of view, the Solem method it's essentially quashing what was a kind of lovely living tradition of improvisation and chant performance and all that sort of stuff.
Mm,
Um, chant is an extremely, as we've said before, a rich and complicated topic because it's been in use for over a millennium. So, you know, anytime you're going to impose one way of doing it, you know, you're contradicting some other historical era. So there's lots to say against it from that kind of historicist point of view, I would say.
why did Saint Pius X, why did he like it so much? Did he articulate his reason? I mean, obviously it's in that encyclical, but did he say, like, particularly the method? I know he endorsed the method in the encyclical, or what was it? that
Yeah.
official
It's a
publication.
it's
But
a motu proprio, which is like
right.
one notch down from an encyclical.
Did he ever, in private letters or in conversation with people, say, "I like this method, and here's why"?
Yeah, I mean, the idea is that it by being, free of rhythm, it is more or having this free rhythmic approach, it is less worldly, right? So
Mm.
there's this whole spirituality that goes along with this free rhythmic approach of Solem. Um, the the you could set up this contrast, if you will, between measured music, which is mechanistic, which is something that could be measured with a metronome, and you could
Mm.
imagine this kind of anti-modern approach, in a way, idealizing this idea of free rhythm, which may or may not have ever existed prior to its advent at Salem in the 19th
But didn't
century. Um, yeah,
no, but didn't you say
go ahead.
Mockereau is kind of a rationalist approach to that, and the metronome has a kind of rational sort of, the ticks of the metronome, and that's perfectly proportioned.
Yeah,
Or is it a
so the
rational approach to the rejection of the past rational approach?
in a way, Mockereau is, adding back a little bit of measuredness into this radically free older Solem approach, by making it something that you can count. If you look at the older Solem method, there's no counting involved at all. It's all about word accent and things like that. But, if you're a musician and you're gonna start thinking about rhythm or talking about rhythm, it's really difficult to get away from the idea of counting and measuring. It's built into the idea of pulse and beat and measure and all of those concepts. So it's yeah, Mokuro is maybe more measured than he might be, and but there he's still on the side of this kind of lofty rhetorical idea, which is essentially anti-modern and is I don't know, you could say it's 19th century antiquarianism, or you could say that it's a restoration of anti-mechanistic purity, depending on your point of view.
Mm. Now, you have to tell me about this correspondence he had with Hugo Riemann because I mean, like on my show, Hugo Riemann's like a villain, but 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 we have to, of course, this was a smart guy and this was an intelligent man and he was very thoughtful. So, what did you? I heard that this was never published, and you got to look at his
Yeah,
letters, and
yeah,
what did
now
they
wait a
talk
second.
about?
Why is Hugo Riemann a villain?
Well, partimento versus function
Okay, okay,
theory, and
yeah.
that's the reason, in a cartoon way, But we're all
Sure,
about
yeah, 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 great.
we're all about
Well,
subtlety. Yeah,
but,
so
uh, yes, Riemann is such an interesting, uh, figure. The function theory is just really one aspect of his entire kind of
right,
output.
right. Yeah.
He's also essentially a historical musicologist. He edits this, music lexicon dictionary, um, and he's incredibly prolific. I mean, just looking at his list of publications is mind-boggling. Um, and I don't know if you know much about his rhythmic theory, but he has
I
this
saw a
whole
bit from your
idea.
presentation. It was
Yeah,
radical stuff.
he has this whole idea that essentially, all music is end-oriented. So,
Mm,
the basic unit of musical rhythm would be like upbeat, downbeat,
mhm.
whereas we maybe think of measures as starting on the downbeat and then
Yeah.
proceeding after. There are really kind of 2 ways to think about it. It's like, is the upbeat something that follows after the downbeat in your grouping, or is it something that precedes the downbeat? Riemann is very much in the latter camp,
Mm,
and it turns out so is Mukro. So the entire, way that the his sort of beat system works is very end-oriented, upbeat, moving to downbeat. Um, and so he exchanged these letters with Riemann, who was maybe one of the leading kind of musical writers at the time, if for no other reason than that he wrote a ton of stuff on every subject.
mm.
And so, yeah, my dissertation work involved actually editing and publishing a bunch of these letters between Mocquereau and Riemann, where Mocquereau is essentially asking Riemann for support of within his little debate with other rhythmic approaches. And essentially, Riemann gives it to him and says, "Yeah, this is really, you know, an interesting way to think about music." So the very back of that dissertation is the
Oh, yeah.
letters between Mocquereau and Riemann.
Can you so what happened in the end? Did they agree? How many letters were there?
There so there are 21, and we have, 21 from Riemann to Mocquereau. Some of them are only little postcards and things. And we have Solem has maintained a copy of one letter that Mocquereau sent to Riemann. Um, and mostly they're just exchanging ideas. Mocquereau ended up publishing, some of what Riemann sent him. Um, One really interesting kind of aspect of it is that Riemann, discovered this, uh, older French music theorist from the early 19th century named Jérôme Joseph Momigny,
I
who's
saw that.
maybe one of the yeah,
I
maybe
saw
one of
that
the
from your
most
presentation.
yeah, maybe one of the most, unusual theorists of rhythm of all time.
Very
He,
confident man too.
very confident, yes, his the title of his book is called, "The Only True, Method of Composing Music." Um, but Momigny, advocated counting measures, backwards, actually. So, that because the downbeat is always, from his point of view, an ending thing rather than a beginning thing, um, you might as well count actual musical groups. So the basic kind of meter of 2/4 or something would have you'd count 2 on what we call the downbeat and 1 on what we call the upbeat. And that's just how music works for Momigny. Anyway, Riemann discovers this book of Momigny, and he kind of immediately and frantically writes this letter to Mocquereau saying, "We found it. We found uh, an antecedent for all this stuff we're talking about, this upbeat oriented
Hmm.
rhythmic approach." And so he says, I mean, it's really quite touching to read it because he says, "Not 5 minutes ago, I discovered this book," and he's frantically copying out passages of it and underlining them and all this sort of stuff. It's quite sweet, in fact. And then Mocquereau ends up publishing in his next volume of the the sort of serialized chant editions he was putting out at the time, he ended up publishing some of these Momigny things and crediting Riemann with them. So I found that whole idea pretty interesting, and that was the basis for my own research because Mocquereau, as I said, he's open to all kinds of criticism. If you're an early music person doing chant now, you probably don't spend much time even thinking about the Solem method because it's not based on medieval performance practice. It's not based on Baroque performance practice. It's not based on any kind of historical performance practice. It is this um, essentially romantic and post-romantic approach to singing music. And historically informed performers don't like to do that anymore. They want to go back and restore things,
Hmm.
restore the old neumes and how we should read them and things like that. So,
Hmm.
Mocquereau is easily dismissed from that point of view, but I was interested in him as a theorist because I think he actually has quite a bit to say about how musical rhythm is put together, and clearly Riemann, thought pretty highly of him, which is interesting and is something that had been previously explored. So that was essentially my grad school research because I just thought this person, you know, it's something that I've encountered through my kind of, church music side of my career and singing chant, and you know, it's both widely denigrated, but also widely popular and still pretty widely used practically in North America. and at the same time, he's corresponding with all these famous music theorists and seems to be involved in these debates about the theory of rhythm in the 19th century. It's very interesting stuff.
Yeah. He also sent letters to Don D. Is that right?
Yes, he had a Vincent Dandy is another kind of, um, really interesting, theorist and writer of the 19th century. Um, Dandy, he has a book about music composition that's, quite an interesting read. Um, he was a harmonic dualist, like Riemann, so
Hmm.
he believed major and minor chords and keys are essentially, like, mirror images of each other, right? If you think about the way a major triad and a minor triad are related, you can kind of invert them around the fifth, so a major triad is major third under a minor third, and then a minor triad is a major third over a minor third. So Dendi and Riemann have this whole idea of overchords and underchords and all this sort of stuff. Anyway, Dendi is also an incorrigible upbeat person, or as I
Incorrigible.
yeah, as my wonderful thesis advisor, William Rothstein would label him an upbeatnik, because he's sort of, oriented in this kind of upbeat moving to downbeat way.
Yeah.
And so he also corresponded with Mocquereau. However, as, uh, as a matter of, the kind of internal church music politics, Dendi was also strongly on the old Solem side.
Oh.
So yeah, so he ended up, he and Mocquereau essentially quarreled and, Dendi end up taking the kind of old Solem side, within the kind of, French musical politics of the time, which of course were very heated, as French politics always are.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting. Dendi outlived Mocquereau, not by very long. Mocquereau died in 1930, and Dendi published, or didn't publish, but he sent a letter to um, Mocquereau's successor as choirmaster of Salem, which I thought was quite touching because he essentially said, "Yeah, we disagreed about a lot of things, but he always Mocquereau always had this supreme goal of obtaining truth and the like." So it's kind of interesting correspondence between those two.
Okay, let's say you dismiss the new method and now I'm using the old stuff. Yeah, I'm really, but I can just imagine that even if you did that, there would be other people who say, all right, if you're going to do that, you're not good enough. You have to be even more ancient and even more authentic. And where, like, who is the most authentic? Yeah,
Earlier than
who's,
thou,
which
right?
method is the most, authentic?
So the there's not widespread agreement about this,
Yeah.
but, if you go back to that colloquium handout, you can kind of see this semiology idea, um, and this at least is the current viewpoint on kind of what the most, what research can tell us about performance, right? The There's always going to be a limit to it because we if you think Baroque performance practice is difficult, performance practice of Carolingian music, that is like the time of Charlemagne, like circa 800, is even harder to have any kind of grasp on. What's interesting about it is we the music notation, the earliest music notations give a lot of rhythmic information, they give almost no pitch information. They're these kind of free floating neumes. If you scroll down to the, example, I'll show you what I mean by that. Um, there, let's see, if you go down, this is what the yeah, scroll down a little further and we'll take
I'm not
yeah,
sure.
we'll go back to that, inclina.
Mm,
Yeah, yeah, up.
it- Up one
Sorry.
more?
I think it's
This one?
yeah.
Or is it this one?
Um, this is in the that's You can,
I
yeah, scroll
don't.
down to 4.3, and, you can see that, yeah, this is so what's
Well, all
okay,
these
yeah, the
squiggles?
yes, exactly. So, just
Oh, good luck with
go
that.
back to go back to chapter 3 actually, because there's a
Okay.
yeah, so what we have here is the same melody, "Inclina aurem tuam," but what is this is a score that a semiologist would read from. It's, essentially copies some of these early manuscripts. So, above the staff, or on at least in the top half of the staff in black, you have the neumes of, this manuscript currently in the municipal library in Laon, and it's one kind of, it's what we call Messine neumes. These are, a ninth century notation, and they've been faithfully hand copied into the modern score.
That's
If you
Elvish.
were
I mean,
looking at
that's from
yeah,
Middle Earth.
if you're looking at the book, by itself, it doesn't give you any pitch information. It tells you all kinds of rhythmic, stuff, but it doesn't tell you what note to start on or what intervals to sing. It tells you melodic contour. Like, if you look at the second little neum there on the word "cli" on the syllable "cli" of inclina,
Oh.
you have, yeah, if you scroll up just a little bit.
Oh, sorry, you missed,
Yeah,
inclina.
there you go. So, you can see, on incli of on the syllable "cli," we have 3 notes, right?
Yeah.
And they have the shape low, high, low. And if you look above, you can see that the neum above shows you that shape. It's essentially a three-part gesture. And then below the staff in red, you have, from a Swiss manuscript now in the monastery at St. Gall, um,
Whew.
a different style of script. So, essentially, what you do if you are, a researcher of this approach is you learn to read both those scripts, and they're not actually that difficult,
Mm.
and there are different ways of, notating the same melodic shapes. So, for instance, um, just to take a really simple example, on "cli" of inclina, we have three-note group, low, high, low, and it's written, it looks a little bit like a snake below if you're looking at the red one,
Yeah.
or it looks maybe like a witch's hat or something if you're looking at the top one. And if you are familiar with the notation, you learn that that's basically the more cursive way of writing that three-note group, low, high, low. And if you look at the beginning of accelera on the syllable le, this was the part we were looking at earlier
Yeah.
with Mocquereau, saying, that you have to count it in these groups of 2 and things like that. You have a different way of writing 3 notes. Do you see the little snake in the lower writing on "le" of "accelera"? Now
Mhm.
the snake is kind of standing up,
Right,
and
right,
the
yeah.
rhythmic information what that means is that it's slower or heavier or something. It's the less kind of fluid way of writing that three-note group. And then if you look at the manuscript above, you see also those 3 notes have been turned into kind of 3 separate notes, and then there's a tiny letter A written, which means algete or,
Mm.
weight. It's essentially showing you, those 3 notes are meant to be slower or heavier than the first 3 notes. Now, that also informed Mocquereau's approach, so that's why Mocquereau writes that dash in,
Mm.
um, that also tells you to go slower there. However, if you're a semiologist, you don't read that Mocquereau stuff at all, you're getting the notes of the staff and you're
Mhm.
getting the rhythm from the manuscripts and singing accordingly. And it's got much more kind of rhythmic differentiation than anything that we saw with Mocquereau or Potier. Um, and then the kind of distinction among historically informed performers is does the does the slower version of that three-note group mean that each note is twice as long as the faster version? or does it mean that it's just a little bit longer? And that's the kind of debate between semiology and
Wow.
men.
Wow.
So,
I'm
maybe
impressed
what
already. I'm already impressed.
well, okay, so now my job has been to convince you of each one in succession so that you can
They're
see
all good. Like you
what a
said, they're
quandary
all
we're in.
yeah, it's
Um,
all good.
so, but a
Wow.
semiologist looks at this and decides to sing according to maybe adding, different amounts of time for the longer versions of the notes, whereas a menstrualist, is going to look at this and fit it onto a grid,
Hmm.
and then so those are the 2 kind of current historically informed ways of doing it, which are also maybe, you know, at odds with each other and also at odds with the kind of Solem approach.
What were they doing in Palestrina's time?
In Palestrina's time, they would have, essentially sung each note long as, you know, as essentially like an equalist approach. Um, and then they're primarily thinking about setting the chant as a cantus firmus in a polyphonic setting. It would have been accompanied and quite heavy, and the chant editions were themselves quite different. So you might if you were doing this in the 16th century, and let's say it's accompanied, something like that. It might be like inclina aurem tuam, etc. And you
That's
see it's
good
kind of
too. That's also
yeah,
good.
it's all right.
Oh my
Um,
goodness. That was great.
and so if so if you are doing if you're doing chant in the context of Renaissance music, maybe you want to sing from an actual Renaissance edition. Palestrina was commissioned by Pope Gregory the 13th in the 1570s to edit a new edition of Gregorian chant that was going to be the kind of standard. He never actually finished it, but it was what we now call the Medicean edition. It was later finished by other kind of solfeggio partimento stars like Banchieri, and published accordingly. And so you would have that kind of chant, but it was often accompanied by the organ or perhaps by the serpent or other instruments. It was
Wait,
the
so
basis
wait, you
for
said the
improv.
serpent. I'm not getting that. What
Oh
is the
yeah,
serpent? That's not a snake, right?
it's not a snake. It's do you know what the cornetto is, presumably, right?
Some kind
It's
of
like
trumpet, right?
it's a trumpet like it's got a trumpet like mouthpiece, but
Hmm.
it's a wooden instrument with holes like a recorder.
Okay.
And it's a rather beautiful, it sounds quite human and fragile. Anyway, the serpent is the kind of alto or tenor of the family. Yeah, there you go.
Oh, this
So
thing.
it's
Yeah.
yeah,
Oh
and
wow.
you can see why they call it a serpent, right? So
I don't even
it
believe that's
really
a
just
real instrument, but yeah, there
and
it is.
so it's got essentially a brass mouthpiece.
Yep.
But the instrument itself is made of wood wrapped in leather, and so it's actually, quite soft and gentle and, maybe softer than a bassoon, softer than a tuba for sure, but still kind of providing this low support. And so this would have been the instrument par excellence for accompanying chant, um, in many places in the 18th and 19th century, and it's just sort of you do the chant as you might say for cooking, low and slow. So you sing the chant and it's all accompanied kind of at the unison with the serpent. Um, there are serpent treatises that talk about how to do this. The serpent could occasionally harmonize. The serpent could do divisions and diminutions. It's a really kind of interesting subfield, which I don't know a ton about, but
This is my
but
first time hearing about it. I've never seen this in
yeah.
my life. Wow.
Well, yeah, a serpent player in the 19th century would have had to be trained in essentially, extemporaneous chant accompaniment, which is kind of interesting.
Wonderful. Well, it's been really great. I think I grasp the general debate. I think so, thanks to
Mhm.
you. And I think that was very clear. And I just wish more people were introduced to chant. I think it's so lovely. I think I read somewhere that Arvo Part was like kind of done with all this the atonal serialism and a lot of the very modern. And he said, I just went back to chant, and I just got
Yeah.
so much out of it. And I think that a lot of people will feel the same way. It's so calming. It's so. I mean, look, I like Liszt, I like Chopin, I like all of that very much so. But sometimes it's almost hygienic to go back to this, and it's maybe you. Why don't you? What is the appeal of chant? I want you to say it because you've probably pitched this genre of music.
Sure, I mean,
So
yeah, I think its appeal is, a lot of people feel it, right? It is, a kind of quintessentially spiritual music, right? You hear monks chanting or nuns chanting, and it's true in other religious traditions as well, of course, but, in the kind of, Western, Catholic tradition, you hear monks chanting, and you're instantly, transported into this kind of numinous realm, and, I think a lot of people feel that regardless of their personal religious beliefs and things like that. I just thinking as what I do in my day job is essentially teaching, uh, you know, theory to historically informed performers, and to me, it's almost like the missing link with a lot of the partimento solfeggio stuff. The kind of liturgical background for that was that these Neapolitan choir boys sang chant all the time. It was a part of their daily musical diet, and um, so I like to use it a lot in my pedagogy. Uh, teaching essentially we have a kind of our own ear training curriculum for the historically informed performers at Juilliard, and we do chant, and we learn how to solmize it with six note solfege. Here you see, this is what a more Baroque chant edition would look like. You could see the typeface is rather different from what we were looking at before. Um, but these are kind of more beautiful. This is the edition of the gradual that Palestrina was supposed to do and never really got around to, but it
mm,
eventually got published in 1614. Um, and this would have been the kind of chant edition sung from in those older styles. And so I think it's really important to um, use with my students because it was such a typical feature of the daily life. It's tied up with things like the modes and the hexachords. A lot of those ideas were something that you would do first in chant and then only apply later to other kinds of music. So it has lots of different ways of appealing. I think it's just for musical enjoyment. People love to hear chant. I also think it's really important for historically informed uh, theory pedagogy to think about um, how central chant was to the musical lives of the people doing all this partimento and solfeggio stuff that we all care so much about.
yeah, I mean, what Haydn was a church singer. I'm sure Mozart too. I mean, they were Catholic. I know Chopin had a very devout childhood in Poland.
And it
Liszt,
wa and a deathbed conversion too. Deathbed
yes,
reconversion
everyone should
Chopin.
check that out. It was very touching. Liszt became an Abbe Liszt, so
Yes, Father
it's
Liszt if Liszt, used chant in a lot of his later compositions. You know, he has he studied, chant harmonization, this kind of Parisian school, and the modality of it that is used by Liszt is also very chant derived, at least as it was understood in the 19th century. So you kind of can't get away from it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's Liszt definitely before entering the priesthood.
That's
Um,
the virtuoso list. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Well, great. Dr. Weaver, Dr. Charles Weaver, Juilliard, great professor. Thank you so much for explaining this whole topic. Just a drop in the ocean, wasn't it? So it really is.
there's so much more to say, and I hope you know I think I
Here's
think
your
learning all these different approaches is really great.
I'll put a
Um,
link to your articles on CC Watershed. There's a lot of good stuff here that people can look at. They can look at the debate. Even your dissertation is there. And yeah, no, I mean, for my shows, definitely in 2025, I want to have I want to have more chant episodes because I think it's tied to historical pedagogy and exactly what you just said. So, Dr. Weaver, thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Take care.